welcome to Housemans, and thank you so much for attending tonight's talk. For those of you who haven't been to the shop, Housemans is one of the oldest and last remaining radical bookshops in the UK. We're based in King's Cross. We're currently open in store and for online orders, but our events program is entirely online for the foreseeable future. We have a few more talks and discussions coming up over the next few weeks, so if you want to have a look at our website, you can book more talks and events there. Thank you especially for those of you who are here tonight with solidarity tickets. We are so grateful to you for helping us to keep these events as affordable and accessible as possible and allowed us to continue to run them through the pandemic. For tonight's event, we're joined by Paolo Gerbaudo to explore his latest book, The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic, which was published last year by Verso. Paolo is a sociologist and political theorist based at King's College London, where he acts as the director of the Centre for Digital Culture. He's also the author of Tweets in the Streets, The Mask and the Flag, and The Digital Party. He's written for The New Statesman, The Guardian, and a number of other publications as well. He's in conversation with James Meadway. James is the director of the Progressive Economy Forum and a former advisor to Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. There's a Q&A box for you to post your questions in. There's also a chat if you want to share some thoughts or comments throughout the event, but we'd really like it if you kept your specific questions to the Q&A. It makes it all a little bit easier to manage. We'll be keeping an eye on both of them throughout the event. And with that, I'm ready to hand over to our speakers. So thank you so much to Paolo and James for joining us tonight.
Okay, thank you. I think that falls to me to make a start on the sort of discussion this evening. So what I wanted to do was put some questions to Paolo about the book and about his work, and then open to the floor and to people who are in the wider audience here to put their own questions, and then we'll run it on that basis, put their own questions to Paolo, and he can come back on that. And I was pleased to be asked to talk about this, because I think there's been a discussion, and it's been there since before really before the pandemic started, but I think the COVID has sharpened the issue somewhat about what exactly has happened in the last few years. That for those of us who've been around long enough, it's probably actually 20 years now of activism in various forms, who've gone through the anti-globalisation movement in the early 2000s, the anti-war movement to the sort of mid-2000s, and then this trough coming out of the 2010s, and particularly 2008, and I'll come back to that point, that you got used to a world where there was no alternative, to coin the phrase, that history had kind of ended and people would protest around the edges, but really nothing fundamental to the system was going to happen. And then, of course, in the middle of this 20-year period, you get 2008 crisis, you get the failure of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, you get the global financial crisis that erupts from that, you get the recession, you get the rest of it, and you get a great deal of brave talk at the time about neoliberalism, this big, seemingly entirely dominant system and way of thinking coming to an end, and things being radically different as a result. And then you had another 10 years and it still hadn't happened. And then, and I think what struck me recently is that the signs that we are now coming to an end to this period, to end to something that we could easily identify as neoliberalism, seems to be much more apparent now than it was after 2008, even a few years after 2008. I mean, this has been an ongoing systemic crisis for a period of time, built around a kind of questioning the legitimacy of the system, and in particular, certain features of the neoliberal mode of governance. There's still an element of denial, I'd say, on the left about this happening. So I wanted to sort of put the question to Paolo. Two things, really. One is perhaps it's useful to just sort of define what you mean by neoliberalism, because people kick different versions of this around. And the other one is to say, why do you think you're right now to say it's coming to an end, or it looks like it's coming to an end, when it wasn't in 2008? What's the decisive factor that's changed between the two periods of time?
Thanks, James. Yes, that is really the key idea in the book, right? This idea of a transition from neoliberalism to something new that I describe as neostatism, as a different consensus on the need for greater government interventionism. And possibly it's the most contentious, controversial idea of the book, though some people share it with me. I mean, namely you. I mean, you, James, have been also very much making this point, right? That neoliberalism is, I mean, not disappearing, right? But in a way, fading away from the center of the political space as an unrivaled consensus, right? That was in a way shared by the left and the right for so many years, right? I mean, usually people say 40 years, right? If we date the beginning of neoliberal hegemony back to the beginning of the 80s. Neoliberalism is a very big beast, right? I mean, it has different definitions to it. Obviously, kind of David Harvey, Short History of Neoliberalism is a kind of reference point for that. And usually it can be described as a certain doctrine, right? I mean, so a political and economic doctrine, therefore as a body of intellectual work, obviously kind of von Hayek, von Mises, Milton Friedman, and so on and so forth. It can be understood as a project, and specifically as a kind of as a class project, as a class alliance, right? So that has a more kind of practical and political understanding, right? And it can be finally understood as an historical period, right? In a sense, as a moment of consensus in society that defines a certain historical era. So that is actually the element of neoliberalism that I'm emphasizing more in the book, right? This idea, I mean, ultimately, methodologically and theoretically, the most important point is this idea of ideological cycles, right, or ideological eras, right? Much in drawing an analogy with long waves, right, described by Kondratiev and then many other economists, this idea that the economy and society moves in long waves, right, of 30, 40 years. And this is something that in a way is current in, and is often assumed in much political analysis, right? When people talk about social democratic era or Fordist era or Keynesian era, or whatever the kind of alternate names people give them, when people talk about the era of classical liberalism, right? Yep. Classical liberalism before World War II, before 1929, basically, right? So there is this sense that though is often kind of left unexplored, that historical eras are defined by moments of consensus that are shared by the left, the mainstream left and the mainstream right, at least, right? So by the parliamentary parties. Which is very important because it means that this consensus acts as a framework where one, in a way, needs to position oneself within itself. One is forced, in a way, to accept some elements of this consensus. I mean, paradoxically, even the movements contesting this consensus are positioning themselves vis-a-vis this consensus. So in a way, they are accepting this consensus. So in a way, the anti-globalization movement partly had to do that, right? By contesting neoliberalism, it had to kind of partly work within neoliberalism, with one foot at least within neoliberalism. So now this argument that neoliberalism is fading in its relevance is something that is very controversial. I think is the point of the book, though it is really the cornerstone of the book, but it has not gone down too well with many on the left. And partly there are reasons for that. There are good motivations for that, because too many times already we have heard people telling us in the past that neoliberalism was over, right? While soon after, politicians fielded policies that were very neoliberal. I mean, so in a way, after 2008, you have a moment of reflection and rediscussion and attempt of articulating a new paradigm, right? Which lasts for a very short time, because soon the kind of sovereign bond crisis, especially in Europe, kicks in. An attempt kicks in to try to salvage the neoliberal project by saying that what happened with the great financial crisis was not to blame, was not to be blamed on the market or on neoliberal policies, but rather on profligate states, governments, overspending, debts, and so on and so forth, right? So they really try to salvage the project through what Will Davies, I think, has poignantly described as punitive neoliberalism, right? So there are many lives to neoliberalism, really, you know what I mean? And that is the most sadistic life of all the ones that we witness, in the sense that it is not anymore the optimistic neoliberalism, say, of the 90s or the early noughties. It is neoliberalism that doesn't promise you that things are going to get better. It is a neoliberalism that is very moralistic, that tells you you spend too much money and we need to cut your services, your cherished public services, as people would discover, right? Education, hospitals, and so on and so forth. But in a way, all moments of ideological consensus don't disappear in one go. Often the process is more akin to a process of slow erosion that then typically ends with a burst at the end. Right? So in a way, the foundations of a given ideological edifice, unless you are in a revolutionary situation, right, kind of war of movement where things happen very fast, what you have is a slow erosion of the existing consensus until you have a tipping point. It's a bit like with glaciers, right? In a way, climate change in a way works in similar ways. There's this slow and mostly invisible process of erosion that then culminates in a tipping point where the whole edifice collapses, and that clears the space for something new. It can also be that the dominant consensus or the incumbent consensus continues to operate despite the fact that it is morally and economically bankrupt, simply because there is nothing to displace it. Right? And that is partly the kind of curious thing with a world of ideas. That often, I mean, we sometimes think of ideas and doctrines and ideology as something that is ghost-like, that is something that is in a way ineffable, and therefore something that you can probably shape and transform very easily. But it is not the case at all. Often it is more the kind of ideological world that tries to catch up with material reality, to kind of run after material reality and try to make sense of that. Also because there are investments in that, right? I mean, there are classic interests that are inertial. They have a vested interest in the continuation of ideological things as they are. There are also investments in the academic world. You know, like we know how economics departments have been so thoroughly hegemonized, right, by people that have been peddling the same recipe. Now, for these people to say what I said in the last 30 years of my life was all wrong is something that would require a very high degree of intellectual honesty, right? Which is actually not what happens in most cases. So this is all to say that what we witnessed in the 2010s was the long agony of neoliberalism, right? So was the zombie liberalism as an ideology that lost its impetus, right? It lost its momentum, and that finally, having exhausted its energy, having exhausted its sense of purpose, right? In a way, as it happens with any ideological era, right? As it has found itself against obstacles that were more and more insurmountable, finally, the pandemic has been more of a moment of revelation, in a way, of how much out of touch neoliberalism was vis-a-vis material reality and vis-a-vis policy making. So now my sense to conclude is that neoliberalism served politically and propagandistically for the left a very important purpose, because it was a shorthand term that with one word, it could conjure up a complex set of things, policies, attitudes, beliefs, right? But in a way, my sense is that its utility is now over to a great extent, because it has also led the left in a way to confuse neoliberalism to equate neoliberalism as one specific regime of accumulation or as one specific model of capitalism with capitalism writ large. Well, capitalism exists in many forms under many regimes. And I think now for us, the more creative and useful task is to really question what capitalism has become without taking neoliberalism as a sort of default answer to that.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that actually, because I think the utility of neoliberalism as a concept, I mean, it's unfortunate that as a word, it's just a bit of a mouthful to say in English, but it moved from being an academic term or one amongst the sort of more obviously committed activist left into one that's in a far wider circulation now. And I think at least in Britain, probably across Europe in general, you can say there's a very large number of people who have at least some concept of what the term is referring to. There's a sort of general sense of what it might mean. But it also had this sort of, and you touch on this in your last comments, a kind of strategic function in that it would give you a way of assembling a bunch of people who might otherwise disagree. It could have a whole load of people who are very radical and say they want to get rid of capitalism, and a whole load of people who want to say they want to reform capitalism a bit, and all of them can agree on this sort of common enemy of neoliberalism. It gives you something to talk about. And this is, I think, particularly striking when you do, and I want to question you about this, and you do sort of deal with the theorists of populism, for whom the idea that you're going to create an enemy and get everybody to point at it is basically the foundational point of politics, any kind of populist politics. If you take Ernesto Laclau or Chantal Mouffe in particular, is about the creation of this sort of verbal opposition. It doesn't really matter in some ways what you oppose, as long as you're getting everyone to sort of point in the same thing and say, this is what we oppose. So you created this opposition. That's what brings together the movement. And I think you're quite critical of that conception of politics, that idea that politics is entirely a sort of verbal operation. I just wondered if you might be able to talk a little bit more about where you think it falls short and what you think the alternative is. Because I think there's a slight tension in your book between the description of these sort of ideological movements, it's backwards and forwards, the ebbs and flows of ideology, and what's happening to the economy itself, if you like, what's happening to the actual way capitalism is organizing. So I wonder if you might want to talk a bit about your kind of disagreements with that discursive view of how politics operates and what populist movements are and how it fits into a broader sense of, or a broader understanding of like the economy and how capitalism actually functions.
Yes, I mean, I very much come from that tradition, and I'm informed by that tradition of discourse analysis and theory of populism, because I think it explained many things that were happening in the 2010s. And Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe's theory was useful in making sense of discursive and symbolic phenomena that often were, in a way, sidelined in traditional Marxist analysis. In a way that I think was refreshing and useful at a time when these theories were first formulated. So partly this goes back to the old Althusserian debates, which were very much in the back of my mind writing the book. Actually, I had a chapter that was more methodological, theoretical, about all these old debate between Althusser and then kind of his pupils, Nikos Poulantzas in particular, and Ernesto Laclau, because Ernesto Laclau theory very much emerges from a dialogue with Poulantzas. And within that, I mean, the status of ideology, right? What is ideology? And how does, I mean, the old debate ultimately, right, of things and ideas, right, thought and reality, a debate that is very philosophical and leads often people astray, but that is in a way useful to engage with. I mean, very briefly, in a way, Poulantzas' theory was that ideology is simply the projection of class interest, in a way, in the sphere of ideas. So any ideological content will have a class basis to it, right? Will have a class referent. So say statolatry is the ideology of shopkeepers because shopkeepers love the police because they need to defend their shop premises, right? Against whatever, petty crimes, so on and so forth. While Laclau takes the opposite position, he basically says, not at all. I mean, ideology is completely flexible, is completely eclectic, right? I mean, liberalism can be supported at different points in time by different classes and so on and so forth. But that takes him and Chantal Mouffe to the extreme of conceiving of populism as something that has no class rootedness whatsoever, which on the one hand, analytically, it's effective because you can explain why it is so ineffable and why it appears everywhere. But on the other hand, strategically, it is really problematic because you don't understand which interest you should represent within that framework. Or, for example, problems that may happen in your electoral coalition resulting from different and sometimes contradictory class interests among the electoral base that supports you. I mean, I think this was very clearly seen, for example, with the Syriza government in 2015 and the famous Ohi referendum, where you could clearly see that on the one hand, the populist discourse was bringing together, say, working class and sections of the middle class. But then when you're faced with a dilemma in a so-called social bloc, right? Social bloc with these two pieces. But when you go against a dilemma choice, in that case, the dilemma was, should we leave the EU or not? You see the class interest resurfacing. Basically at the time, like middle class with bank accounts denominated in euro and houses, right? They had a very divergent interest vis-a-vis the working class that basically had very little to lose and perhaps something to gain in the medium to long term, right? So my attempt is to find some accommodation between the two things, between discourse analysis and political economy considerations. So, I mean, obviously, as training, preparation, I'm not kind of political economist, I'm not an economist. I'm someone who is specialized more in the analysis of political discourse and ideology. But my sense is that there is no way you can actually understand the content of ideology and the content of political ideas unless you link it with what is happening at the material level, right? And ideas are very important in politics. They have a certain degree of autonomy to them and a certain degree of creativity. They cannot be completely reduced to their class determinants. But at the same time, if you lose the class determinants, you're in a way losing the meaning. You're losing the sense of the signified while kind of over-focusing on the signified.
Okay, I mean, I think on that, it's also quite useful to sort of, I mean, this is what I think your method, your broader scheme, these ideological waves, it kind of historicizes neoliberalism. It puts it in, it gives it a way to think about what this is in history rather than this is just the foundation of what reality itself is. I think some of the, particularly around populism, particularly around whether it was whether people really had it as they consciously recognized. So I'm thinking here particularly of Corbynism and involvement with the movement around that, whether people sort of consciously recognized that this is what they were doing. But the effect was to kind of assume that neoliberalism was all encompassing and that your opposition to it had to point to specific parts of this, but basically this would be the terrain of everything that it was. And your operation to get rid of it was to win the election and sort of discursively overturn all this. So you could just declare that you would want to do these things. You'd say, okay, we say boo hiss to billionaires. This is changing the terrain so much. This is itself a challenge to neoliberalism, and starting to forget two parts, one of which is that it's just very hard if you ever actually end up in government to really change things. You will be sitting in the middle of a capitalist state trying to pull levers that may not work. It's one part of it. The second part of it is, I think exactly as you say, it starts to gloss over the need to assemble a block of different material interests in some form, and stops you having to think about what those material interests might actually, might be, that different people want different things at different times, that your assumption that everybody just wants to spend loads of money in public services may cover a fair bit of your historic block, but it doesn't cover absolutely every part of it. And you need to find something to say to small business owners or whoever it might be at the edges of who you're speaking to. And I think the book does a useful job of dragging, in some ways, that discussion away from just a pure focus on this operation at the level of language and into a kind of more historic sense of what's going on. But I wanted to pick up on there, in particular, the influence of Karl Polanyi, who you reference a fair bit, and who I think one reading of his Great Transformation that's been popular probably amongst those people looking for an ending to neoliberalism since 2008, which is the idea of the double movement, that you get a shift into a market society, provokes a reaction from society, which tries to, ground things back in the reality of people's lives. So instead of just having a pure market, you try and put in controls that drag this terrible distortion of society that is the market. This is Polanyi's theory, back towards how people actually live their lives. And this is the backwards and forwards shift. And that you end up with quite a cyclical theory of history out of this, and one that may not necessarily have that much to do with like your sort of Marxist version of the world, which is all about who gets the surplus. It has quite a lot to do with legal forms and in Marxist sense, superstructural elements there. But it also strongly suggests, and this is the question, I suppose, that there isn't some way out of this, that you're just stuck, and your kind of ideological wave suggests this, that the thing goes up when it goes down. You have more state, you have less state. There's never any break with this. You just carry on. Does that mean that, if you're on the left, you should just ride the wave on its way upwards into this neo-statist, you call it, version of capitalist society? Or is it necessary to think of a break completely with that pattern and to think about an alternative to capitalism in total?
Yeah, I mean, there is a very complex kind of philosophical question, and obviously kind of Marxism had an embedded teleology to it, in the sense that it had this idea that, socialism would be the end of history, or kind of communism, more probably, right? I mean, in that, I'm a bit kind of a Marxist and perhaps an Hegelian, in the sense of thinking that in a way, history will always continue, and it will always, there will never be an end, even either a bad end or a good end, but there will be phases that do kind of move in a more progressive direction or in a regressive direction. And in a way, there is a bit of a kind of fatalism to that as well, that has to do with these historical phases where, say, you have a moment in the kind of genetic phase of an ideological era, where, let's take neoliberalism, right? Stagflation demonstrates some fallacies, right, in the Keynesian Weltanschauung, in the Keynesian worldview. The problem is that Keynesian economists cannot really explain certain things within their framework, right? Or cannot explain them in a convincing way. So neoliberalism, that was already long formulated, its ideas, since the 30s, and so on and so forth, at the moment kind of emerges as a response. And at that point, it has a sort of initial scenario where it has a lot of work to do. It has a very long task ahead, right? Because it emerges in a society shaped by a Keynesian paradigm. And at the beginning, it very much engages in a task of demolition, like of demolition of old structures of control and protection, right, inherited from the social democratic era. And it has so much opportunity to exploit. There are homes to be privatized, right, to be sold to their owners. There are unions to be disbanded, and workers to be further exploited. There are foreign markets to be conquered, right? There's so much space for it to go. But in a way, that project then comes to a point of exhaustion, comes to a point of asphyxia, right? It is a bit like a fire that at some point kind of lacks oxygen, precisely because of its success, right? It starts to crash against some inherent contradictions, right? So in a way, I would say that any ideological era, in a way, is bound at some point to face up these contradictions. But that doesn't mean, in a way, kind of renouncing to kind of optimistic, I mean, in a way, quasi-utopian idea of a kind of socialist society, but that rather than the sort of traditional Marxist revolutionary imaginary of a mythic, decisive event in history. I mean, the famous kind of general strike in Sorel's thinking, say, or kind of the moment of revolution as the moment of culmination and resolution of history. In a way, you always need to accept that it's going to be a very drawn out, like, struggle, right, with peaks and low points.
Not a particularly what's the word? Not a particularly reassuring answer in some ways. You've basically removed the sort of historical guarantees that you might put in place if you're a very old school Marxist, or for that matter, Hegelian, or a Francis Fukuyama, of course. But probably a more convincing one to just say that, okay, this is a sort of open-ended process to that extent. It does slightly. I didn't wonder how to sort of phrase this, because it's sort of, you talk in the book about neostatalism, I think is the phrase you used to say, like, this is what we move into instead. I just wanted to ask, well, what do you think that represents? And what are the options? Because sometimes you say to people, because neoliberalism has become so sort of deeply embedded on the left as how they think about the world, if you say neoliberalism is ending, or it is coming to an end, or it is dying, there's an automatic belief that this means you think it is going to get replaced with something better. That whatever turns up afterwards, it just has to be kind of not this. And I think it's a really quite a severe failure of imagination to start to think that this is as bad as it can possibly get, right? We know that this can get a lot worse, and it probably will get a lot worse. So there's real, I always have a bit of a problem when people start to think that, you know, in the end, neoliberalism means you must be saying something better. It is going to arrive. So I'm wondering if perhaps you could talk a bit about what you mean by neostatalism, and perhaps a sort of the variations on a theme that you might anticipate seeing.
Yes, I mean, in a way, for me, neostatism was the answer to the question, what may come after neoliberalism? And also an attempt to go beyond populism as the answer to that. Because in a way, the beginning of the book was very much about populism. But populism always had this kind of formalistic kind of explanation to it, right? I mean, it is a boisterous, bombastic politics, appeal to the people, charismatic, vulgar, and so on and so forth. But I was realizing, kind of studying this course, because there is the kind of the material of analysis, right? Studying basically speeches by politicians, declarations, interviews, party manifestos, policies, that there was something more to it that couldn't be explained only by saying this is populism. And that there was something having to do with the state. Right? I mean, in a way, that was kind of my realization. I mean, in a way, it's not that original, in the sense that many people have been talking about the return of state capitalism, the return of developmentalism, the return of a more interventionist state. But in a way, if anything, perhaps the kind of my more creative attempt was to piece together these three things, like neoliberalism, populism as a kind of negative response to it, and then neostatism as an attempt to, more constructive attempt in a way, to define a new paradigm. Now, what is this neostatism? I mean, I would describe it as a loose bipartisan consensus on the need for greater state interventionism as a means to cope with the problems, the risks, the instability that has been generated by neoliberalism's triumph and decline. So it is very much, at the moment, it is very much, how you say, a sort of phantom-like construct. It is not, say, as at the moment as clearly articulated as neoliberalism, but it really boils down to this. Vis-a-vis the idea of neoliberalism, that the state was wasteful, was bad, was inefficient, that you had to reduce state control and state protection. I mean, and you find it across all neoliberals, right, of different descriptions. We, in recent years, we have been seeing this majority consensus on the fact that the state has to intervene or the state has to provide. Right? So imagine during the pandemic, I mean, these people like we're seeing a lot on the US Twitter, right? That, you know, like this idea that also this perception by ordinary citizens that, hey, I have no job, I have no money, I mean, the state has to provide. I mean, especially in the US, was not something that kind of common sense like a few years ago. I mean, if you are in trouble, you need to offer, I mean, the entrepreneurial state or the entrepreneur state. For example, Mariana Mazzucato talks about, there's been lots of discussion about industrial policy. In economics, already since 2008, I mean, there was some alternative economic thinking, right, at that time to get to grips with this. There are some quite folkloristic tendencies as well, I mean, like MMT, like modern monetary theory, for all its problems, though it was, I think, to me, a kind of an index of this changing thinking around the state, the market, the economy, right? And more generally, climate change. I mean, the sense that, in a way, the only realistic way to address climate change after all the market attempts to solve the problem is to leverage the power of the state, like national climate plans, major state investment. So these realization and these consensus has become part of the entire political spectrum, in a way, except for extreme fringes, with some neoliberals becoming neo-libertarians and espousing a kindergarten version of neoliberalism, which in turn, to me, is a symptom precisely of the ideological crisis of neoliberalism. But then there are very different breeds of these, depending on who people think the state should control and protect. Let me show the two keywords. On the right, there is this proprietary protectionism, which wants to protect country and property and forge the class alliance around that. Country against foreign powers, against foreign workers, also as a way to appeal to sections of the disgruntled sections of the working class, and property against what? Against redistributive demands at a time of huge inequality. While on the left, you have the what I describe as this kind of more kind of eco-socialist protectivism, right? Which is about the need to guarantee minimum conditions, minimum wages, minimum social conditions, minimum levels of public services. In a way, it is not necessarily anti-capitalist. I mean, it's more, in a way, I say, more social democratic in tone, much of it. But you also have a kind of centrist neostatism that is, in a way, using the state to save the market as well, right? I mean, to save. I mean, as you say, I mean, it's not at all given that neostatism is going to be better than neoliberalism. I mean, Italy, where I'm now, I'm in Florence at the moment, is a very sorry vantage point to look at this, because Italy has been the country that suffered austerity the most, I mean, alongside Greece and Spain in Europe. Now there is this historic inversion. I mean, there are 220 billion euros in public investment, but money is used to subsidize the haves with no strategic vision and no industrial policy. Like, for example, what one would do, let's make Italy one of the international leaders in electric vehicles. And to do this, we need to do this. But it's more like very parcelized, very fragmented interventions. Like there are 200 interventions under this program. So meaning that basically is money thrown everywhere with no strategic direction, no strategic vision.
I'll go to, we've had there's a few questions coming now. I think you can see them as well from the Q&A box. Should we take Greg's, who has an interesting preamble here about basically talking about the idea of long waves in ideas. And then in particular, moving on to the question, as he puts it, regarding the tension between different versions of territorialization and deterritorialization, the importance of a sort of deterritorialized globe, a world without borders for global capital. And so his question regards this tension, particularly in the context of borders and bordering. How do we understand this emergent paradigm in which borders and the activities that produce them appear to be so spasmodic and unpredictable? What do we mean when we talk about borders in a world that is caught between desire for the global and the local, between and re-territorialization? It's a fairly big question, I feel. But
very difficult. I mean, what I would say is that, also intellectual debates, the big fashion, say, in the 90s and 2000s was this discourse of deterritorialization. Right? Because, I mean, it had a purchase on reality. Because you had multinational corporations operating across national borders, you had finance moving seamlessly across borders, no capital controls, borders for human beings, but basically no borders for finance and food, I mean, record low tariffs, and so on and so forth. While now, many re-territorialization in many respects, right? I mean, the return of, Brexit being the most famous and perhaps infamous case, but there's many other cases, right, where in that the pandemic, if anything, has been a spectacular moment of revelation of that. Right, with, for example, many expats forced to go back to their countries, places like China that are still basically walled off. Right, I mean, basically you cannot travel to China at the moment because only people with contracts there can travel there. And partly this re-territorialization is precisely driven by the sense of lack of control, right? And the sense and demands for certain forms of territorial control and territorial protection, which do not need necessarily to come in the form of migration control or anti-migration policies. Think, for example, about what you, James, have been writing about recently, right? I mean, semiconductors, for example, in Europe, right? I mean, and this plan to make Europe less more autonomous in terms of production of semiconductors, right? And similar protectionist policies. These are policies that make no sense whatsoever from a neoliberal standpoint, because from a neoliberal standpoint, you need to maximize factor endowment, you need to purchase things in the place where they are the cheapest, and certainly in that case, it's not Europe. But there are other concerns that have to do, for example, with security, right? With security, both economic and otherwise, that, for example, require that things are more local and more territorial, closer to you in order to avoid disruption, for example, the supply chains, especially for semiconductors, which are now found in so many goods that are produced in Europe and elsewhere. So that is my sense. In a way, is a matter of, in a way, is an attempt to balance vis-a-vis the extreme conditions that neoliberalism has fostered. So I'm not thinking that kind of global trade will disappear, or right. I mean that we will have kind of autarkic states, because not even the hermit state, North Korea, is completely autarkic. I mean, actually, it depends on support from China. But vis-a-vis the extreme conditions of global integration witnessed at the height of the neoliberal era, we are likely to witness some degree of reterritorialization of economic activities, because the risks that are connected to it are just too great, basically. And they carry costs as well.
Relating to that, there's a question also from two questions, but let's take them one at a time, from Michael Rainsborough, who says, a great book, even though he's only halfway through, so hopefully we'll continue to think it's great before he reaches the end. But the question is about sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, which he quotes you saying has been more successful, more effective in sort of mobilizing people and attacking the rich and the powerful. And then goes on to ask, can you comment on whether you think the Hegelian theoretical framing of reaction to something as the primary driver of history leads to reactionaries, that some types of politics benefits from this framing, notably the idea of importance of the state, and particularly the military state, which I think is another big question, but I mean, see how you get on with that.
Yes, I mean, so one thing on, so I think what is useful about this idea of reaction or recoil in Hegel is, again, in a way to internalize some degree of fatalism, but there was already there also in Marx. I mean, in the famous phrase by Marx, but men, or say like kind of human beings, make history, but in conditions that they do not control, they do not decide, right? And that is the problem with much utopian politics, right? That in a way tries to draw up ideal worlds, right? But we are considering the kind of the starting point, right? As if you could conjure up a sort of idealized world in a void. Well, in a way, each generation's social and political agenda is in a way already objectively set at the start in terms of the dilemmas it needs to face. So the questions are already there. Then the responses can be radically different, right? So it is not, I'm not kind of promoting total fatalism. It's not that it is a completely kind of deterministic world where we have no choice, no will, but the problems are already determined and are already kind of set at the start. And often these problems have to do with the failures of the previous ideological cycle. It is as if every generation has to deal with their parents' sins. I mean, if you allow me the kind of biblical metaphor, right? And in a way, there's no way to escape that, right? The moment of creativity, of will and freedom is devising strategies to get out of those problems. But we need to accept, in a way, these objective strictures of reality, this kind of, this revenge of the real, like to quote Benjamin Bratton's book title. And the fact, and I think this is very important politically and strategically, that actually we live in the same world as the supporters of Donald Trump, right? I mean, we live actually in the same world as them. We may think completely otherwise, but we live in the same world as Bolsonaro supporter, as alt-right supporter, and as all these people, which means that actually our responses are different responses, but to the same deep-seated social dilemma. I think this is actually something important to abandon excessively voluntaristic visions of politics. And also, that also means that actually we can win over some of those people, right? If we address the problems they are also experiencing in a way that relates to them.
Which sort of leads nicely into a question here from Alan, who asks about what about neoliberalism and the lived experience of the workplace. And this tends to be one of the kind of objections, or at least the arguments against the idea that neoliberalism is on its way out. Is precisely that bit about, well, actually the experience at work remains quite intensely, and in many ways far worse than it was, just a few years ago in terms of the intensity of exploitation. I think it's something particularly, if anybody works in education, higher education especially, the neoliberalization of higher education somewhere like Britain for the last decade or so has been really quite striking. But Alan continues, surely the demand to compete for advancement, treat everybody as a customer, market yourself, performance reviews, etc., and perpetually show evidence that ticking policy boxes shows no signs of abating, though the pandemic may temporarily have halted it and given us a glimpse of an alternative. So it's a sort of, it's moving from I suppose we talked about the kind of, if you like, the high end of neoliberalism, the international and policy and governmental part of it. I think this is getting into an alternative definition of neoliberalism, something closer to the kind of ideas of Foucault in particular. I'd say there's sort of neoliberalism as a lived experience, as a change in how we relate to each other on a fairly interpersonal basis. And Alan, I think, is asking, well, this all looks pretty similar. Like nothing really has changed very much if you're still having to tick boxes and do performance reviews and whatever else you might have to do in today's neoliberal, service sector drone workplace.
Yes, I mean, my girlfriend works as a supply teacher. So I've learned from her. I mean, the very tragic situation. I mean, many of these people who are at the very forefront of neoliberal practices in the workplace have to experience, and these emphasis on complete externalization, which I discuss a lot in the book when I discuss globalization, which is like this orientation towards the outside, supposedly, right? Outsourcing, out-contracting, offshoring, let's go out, let's exploit units, because units somehow are bad, right? They are cages, they are bottling the genius or whatever of the economy. Actually, my first job in London was as web designer for a firm that was offering supply medical jobs. So I also saw that from the evil side. But in a way, it's you can externalize only when things are inside, so to speak, metaphorically, right? I mean, at some point, again, you exhaust the fuel of a project when the project succeeds. So there's not much more that you can externalize these days, nor outsource. And actually, many companies themselves have become aware of the fact that outsourcing also carries costs. It carries managerial costs, carries management costs, it creates uncertainty, it can lower the level of service, it burns out the workforce. Right. I mean, for example, I think Bidenomics, in its original project, we know that much of it failed, but it was an attempt. It was in a way a realization that they were burning out the youth workforce, and that ultimately that wasn't good for capitalism. That they precarized too much the workforce. So interesting now in management circle. After outsourcing, now people are talking about insourcing or in-house. I think even labor under Starmer, I was talking about the NHS, that they need to bring back services in-house. For example, in some universities, you had union struggles, union mobilizations to bring back workers in-house, for example, cleaning workers, right, that were previously externalized. So, in that, there will be a lot of inertia. There will be things that will be, according to, say, my analysis, there will be a long time where things will continue as normal, and where basically also management ideas will be replicated. But also within management circles, we see that new keywords, new catchwords are being mobilized, which to me is very indicative of the fact that neoliberalism potentially is exhausted. Right? That you cannot push a cart against the wall, meaning when you need to change direction.
So there's a sort of hangover of neoliberal forms before the content changes. I mean, I wanted to pick up on that myself, that I think it's a risk with the idea. It's another one that's entered into people's heads if you're on the kind of activisty left or perhaps the more, I don't know, policy focused or academic ends of it, I suppose. But it is the idea of a paradigm shift. That the story of neoliberalism is roughly, once upon a time, the world was Keynesian. Then there was a crisis, and some people, I think Milton Friedman says it, the ideas that win the crisis are the ones that happen to be lying around. Now, the degree to which Friedman is creating his own mythology here, so it's always striking that people just take him as his word. But it's the idea that there's no real transition point, that things just switch quite rapidly. That you go from a sort of non-neoliberal Keynesian world to a neoliberal world, and then that's how the world is. And that if things are going to change again, it's going to be one great moment of rupture. And I think part of your book can be read as a sort of disagreement with that version of how politics operates and how the left should think about the world. There won't be just one sort of glorious day when we all wake up and throw the shackles off and that's it. That you might almost say, and I think you probably disagree with this, but you've ended up with almost a sort of Fabian view of how you might win change, which is that it's going to be quite slow and gradual, at least to start with. That the grand schemes to overthrow one thing and replace it with another might not be what we should be looking at.
Yes, I mean, that would be a kind of possible criticism. I mean, in a way, what I think is that political strategy needs to take into account the conjuncture, the phase, right? In the sense that, say, in the 1990s, there was little way for any kind of radical left force to contend for power, simply because the consensus around the fact that free markets were a force for good was so strong that you could have had the best candidate and whatever, millions of money for your campaign and a strong activist base, but say, even in the best of circumstances, you couldn't really challenge power, or you couldn't really push against the situation. While now, to the contrary, in my sense, there is now a political opening, right? There is clearly a political opening. If anything, so now is the moment for more enthusiastic action, for more radical action, because these moments when an existing incumbent consensus is in crisis and fades away are moments that can be resolved in two ways, basically. I mean, according to Gramsci's analysis of organic crisis. Either the case is that the establishment selectively ditches some policies, principles, tenets that have become untenable. Witness Draghi, that sends the letter in 2011 preaching austerity to Berlusconi in Italy, now becomes the guy of like good debt. Debt is actually good because it's productive. Or witness Biden, right? I mean, one of the most neoliberal politicians now kind of rhetorically, actually, I think this is something that, for example, the left didn't like to recognize. That actually, at least rhetorically, discursively, in terms of the policies that were proposed, there was a very significant shift. And then sometimes it's taken on the left as, no, this is all false, this is all posture, this is all hypocritical, and so on and so forth. And in so doing, is actually quite self-defeating, because in so doing, the left doesn't recognize actually the road that it has already walked and how it has contributed in pushing or in creating an opening for that realignment in the establishment to take place. So moments of realignment in the establishment are actually very interesting, because they are precisely that moment where the center cannot hold, and given it cannot hold, it shifts a little bit, right? It makes small concessions. Obviously, that is not what we should content ourselves with. We need a far more systemic and kind of bold and more radical change. But at least we should welcome, I think, the fact that, for example, Boris Johnson admits that Thatcherism was, in many respects, a disaster, right? Regardless regardless of what the kind of actual policies implements, but already at the discursive ideological level, the fact that that is recognized is a demonstration of the fact that we were right in many of the things that we've been saying for ages, right?
It's. I just want to raise this, and then there's another question here to come back to. But it's strange that people are so resistant to this. I mean, it's so striking that you see it in the US where Biden, on the level of rhetoric and actually on the level of policy commitment and a certain amount of personnel as well. If you dig out the interview with his chief economic advisor from back in March last year, or you look at the appointment of Lena Khan to the Federal Trade Commission, and a real effort, at least around about this time last year, to actually push through a very significant, expansive interventionist program that would, if it played out, would be to the benefit of most working people in America. And that's where the thing landed. Now, this ran into the US political system and the Democratic Party, amongst much else, and precisely some of that hangover, that neoliberal hangover in the form of Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema in particular. But there's a bigger, I think, set of institutional problems there. But the resistance of the left to having a conception where we might actually have gained some terrain and things have shifted, I think has been incredibly striking. Same thing in Britain. Obviously, there was a defeat in 2019 of the Corbyn movement in the election, and then a further defeat in the leadership election in early 2020, which is why Keir Starmer's running the Labour Party now. But a complete unwillingness to get the idea that although these people aren't like from the left and aren't our people, a complete unwillingness to understand that they may have moved and things may have shifted. And at least part of the reason the left is failing to rebuild is failing to understand the ground has changed. It's not just trying to put a false note of optimism on this, but actually having an understanding that the world is not what it used to be, and that if you want to change it, you need to understand how it's already changed in front of you in order to work out what to do next. If neoliberalism is no longer the thing we're confronting, the set of enemies that are out there, the set of problems to deal with starts to look somewhat different to what they did 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. On which I wanted to pick up on Michael's second question, which was many have looked at capitalism, which he says Adam Smith type free market capitalism as being gone and over and replaced by rentier capitalism. So he asks, is the constituency that benefited from neoliberalism just changing into digital feudalism or rentier capitalism, domination rather than exploitation, rather than disappearing? So I suppose it's, okay, I think it's a question about sort of class fractions really, and who benefited from neoliberalism and what are they up to now. But
yes, I mean, obviously there are different constituencies that have benefited from neoliberalism. Otherwise, neoliberalism wouldn't have been so long-lasting. But indeed, I share Michael's sense that in a way there's been a shift in the attitude of this constituency, partly mirroring the evolution of the business cycle. So in the sense that the big wealth was particularly amassed at the moment of highest growth and most accelerated growth, while now is a more defensive phase where monopoly positions have been established, right? I mean, imagine kind of like the digital market, the digital economy, how it was in the mid-noughties, right? Where it was a kind of open playing field. I mean, and with different companies entering, it was quite uncertain what would happen, right? There was still this mythology of the digital frontier and a kind of the online corner shop, right? And then you have all these GAFA like Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon entering and kind of dominating the field and establishing these dominant positions that in some cases may be eroded. I mean, in the case of Facebook, for example, being displaced partly by the rise of TikTok, for example. So one needs to admit that still there is kind of some, in certain cases, some competition between different fractions of capital or different. But for example, in the case of Amazon, it is very hard to see how the dominant position is going to be eroded by another player. So that means that many of these capitalists are turning more into rentier mode because it's much more what they have to lose than what they have to gain, right? Especially as they are approaching like, that at some point it was perhaps an exaggerated projection that through this rentier position, Jeff Bezos would become the world's first trillionaire, whatever, in 2035 or something. But what is clear is that now there's, especially this kind of commanding heights of the digital economy, who have much more to lose than to gain. So they're more in a defensive than offensive position. And that also applies to the kind of the 20%, as was described in a famous book, the dream hoarders. Think about people who have bought multiple homes, people who have amassed, millionaires, right? Besides the billionaires, the millionaires. Obviously, these people in a more stagnating business cycle, with a threat of climate change, with many kind of fundamentals, economic fundamentals that seem to militate against continued growth, they have much more to lose than to gain. And therefore, I think part of the right is trying to cater for their fears. Right? And their fear is basically losing this hoarded wealth that they have managed to amass in an exceptional moment, right, of economic development. In the noughties and 2000s, though growth rates were lower than in the Keynesian era, but still, right, these people have amassed fortunes that probably it will take a long time before another window of opportunity like that opens up again. So indeed, it has turned more into a kind of rentier capitalism, into a monopolistic capitalism, which sometimes what I think is interesting in the discourse of neoliberals is that now they are turning into justificationists of monopolies, right? In a way, as if monopolies were good and natural. Also, the pretense of competitive markets is being ditched.
Yeah, for sure. That said, I think the defense of monopolies has always been usually implicit, but sometimes explicit. Neoliberal. Schumpeter's defense of monopoly.
Yeah,
monopoly is able to fund innovation. That you have to be in a monopoly position to get the savings together to fund research in order to maintain your monopoly position. These sort of arguments you sometimes get. But what's been peculiar now, what's a shift now, at least certainly as of the early 2000s, is that it will be a monopoly and the government will actively work to support this in some form. You get, the argument around tech, big tech in the US is sort of part of that. On one hand, domestically, there are attempts to restrain what the various companies are doing. On the other hand, you get both Donald Trump and Joe Biden's government arguing very aggressively in the interests of Facebook or Amazon or whoever against, for instance, attempts in Europe to restrain some of what they're doing inside the EU and impose higher taxes and this sort of thing. So it's a sort of, from our point of view, I think it looks like a shift driven by changing material circumstances in the economy, and big tech is a very important, I think, underappreciated part of the reason we're moving out of neoliberalism is how these companies behave and how they relate to government. I think it might be a good idea there's a sort of one more question that's come in, and it might be a good idea to sort of wrap up on this one. And thank people for coming and putting their questions, and to thank yourself for the interesting answers and the discussion. But it's also from Michael. It's can you talk a bit how you got a cartoonist to promote your book? Which is, I think, a Greek cartoonist, somebody provided a sort of animated version of the book. He goes on, what questions about cartooning the concepts had to be answered to make this happen? What was it like to see easy to watch cartoon film of your sometimes difficult to read book, a very populist format for a theoretical book?
Yes, that was the attempt, in a sense that I was aware that some parts of the book were quite difficult and heavy. So in a way, the cartoon was an attempt, kind of more populist attempt, to make some of the book's theses more accessible by people who may not be inclined to read an academic book. So, through activist friends in a collective that I've been active in called Propagate, it's a kind of political propaganda collective. That's why it's called Propagate. That we're doing kind of posters, amazing kind of posters on the housing market and on many grievances and ills. And one Greek member of the collective put me in contact with this Greek animation artist. And I think, I mean, there's really a genre of internet communication that has developed in recent years, where you have many people using animation. For example, there are RSA, Animate, right? There's so many examples of education organization using animations to explain very difficult concepts in a visual form, right? That is far more accessible than the textual form of books and articles and so on and so forth. But it's also interesting because sometimes by engaging with this process of translation from one medium to another, it also really challenges to, in a way, clarify your argument or simplify, but at the same time, kind of to retain the essential points of the argument. Right? And also using the visuals, you are forced to research also our imaginary of politics has changed. So, for example, one element that was used in this animation was this famous kind of COVID stimulus check, which in a way is really a condensation, allegory of the situation. I mean, for a very long time, people would never have expected to receive a check from the state telling you that you are entitled to these, how much was it, like $1,400, like, and then there were like 2 or 3, right? There were different rounds of these stimulus checks emerging there. And so I think, yeah, it was quite useful to actually try to condense the argument also in visual form and try to explain it to people who may not end up reading the book.
There we go. Thank you. And I think that's a good point to wrap it up on the how to get the ideas out to people. I would say if people haven't got the book, then they can pick it up from Houseman's or any other good bookshop, I think I'm allowed to say, or indeed online. It is well worth the read, precisely because I think it does challenge, amongst other things, it does challenge that sort of common sense on the left that neoliberalism is here to stay and the world will always be what it is that we've grown up with, rather than thinking about what's changing right now and what's likely to change into the future. So thank you very much to everyone for coming and for your various questions. Thank you to Paolo. And I'll leave it on that. Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon in person.